Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Roll for Banter. This is the podcast where we dive into all things D&D and tabletop related. We're your hosts, August from TTRP Genius.
And I am Anthony, also known as DM Dungeon Mastery.
Whether you're a seasoned game master, a brand new player, or just curious about the world of tabletop gaming, this is the place for you. So grab your dice, settle in, and let's roll for some banter. Well, Anthony, what do we have on the table today?
So, for this episode, I wanted to bring homebrew versus official content to the table. My first question for you, Mr. August, is what do you dislike about official content versus your own homebrew content?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think some of the things I really like about homebrew community is all the creativity that they bring. One of the things I think a lot of the official stat blocks are missing is just that little extra touch of love. For instance, I just did a whole breakdown of gnolls, and what makes them great is that they are just this awesome, ferocious, monstrous race that love bloodshed and violence and raiding as much as the next guy, but then they're vicious and they don't leave anybody behind, and they eat the corpses, and they practice blood magic, and they were originally created as these things, that these hyenas that feasted on the flesh of Yanagu's kills, and it transformed them. And you have like chieftains, and it talks about like harem wives, and you get all that from just the basic wiki. And then when you look into it, when you're super inspired, like this sounds like a great, awesome creature, there are 6 stat blocks. 3 of them are essentially reprints. And then the special ones, you have the Flesh Gnawer. And the Flesh Gnawer, it's this gnoll that likes to rush down and hunt and slash and like chase down running away enemies. They don't even use ranged weapons because the thrill of the kill and the up close and personal is what they live for. And then in the stat block, it's the base gnoll, and they have a action that allows them to do essentially a double dash, and that's all you get from the stat block. And then you get the Fang of Yunagu. It's this gnoll who has feasted upon more flesh and has tasted of demonic blood and has been chosen by Yunagu, their god, as a choice gnoll specimen. And then you get into the stat block, and it's the basic gnoll with more hit points, a little bit beefier stats, and it has a multi-attack. And then you get into the Pack Lord, the leader of this entire tribe. It's supposed to be the strongest, most ferocious gnoll, and it has like one ability that the base gnoll doesn't have. And that's what I think a lot of people are struggling with in the homebrew community.
I was going to say, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I have that same opinion about orcs, because orcs
Yes.
are in the same boat. They have such rich lore, mostly stemming from where they come from, how ingrained in their society their gods are, the different levels that their clerics kind of have as you climb up the ranks, versus depending on which god that orc is worshiping, they should have a specific stat block that represents that. We get some of those, yes, but they're very basic, and there's really nothing extra that is added onto them other than, the most unique orc stat block is the Claw of Luthic, which is a female orc. She gets 4 attacks whenever she gets to half hit points or fewer, which makes her pretty scary and unique. But other than that, most of the other orcs are just these basic little stat blocks that don't really have anything special going on for them. And it's kind of depressing, to be honest with you, for something that has such rich lore behind it. And of course, these are meant to be template stat blocks. I think that's what Wizards intended them to be, but
Absolutely. And that's what's tough, is because then you get into books like you have Icemandel's Rima the Frost Maiden, and inside of Rima the Frost Maiden, you get a updated stat block for a vampire gnoll, and it's really cool, but it's not worth buying an entire module for one stat block. And that's what I took a look at, was looking at the lore, because there's so much already added, and there are so many stat blocks that are just missing one, two, three things on there to really make them stand out and feel like the lore that they represent. Um, for instance, one of the things that's talked about a lot are blood rituals and blood magic inside of Null society and their religion. Once again, their lore, their god is a demon lord. It's Yinagu, one of the strongest and best known demon lords, and they have offerings and rituals to him where they make blood sacrifices. And it's talked about how they use magic and that there are warlocks, but there are no official warlock or necromancer patrons. And then you have like the witherling, which is something that's so underutilized inside of everything that's published for Knolls. The way that the witherling works is in 5th edition, at least, and I know in some of the different editions it gets muddled, but 5th edition, the witherling is the product of null necromancy. What happens is, if there's not enough food and the pack is starting to starve, they start eating the weakest members, but to keep their numbers up, they reanimate the witherlings. And so these are null corpses that have been feasted on by their brethren and used as essentially meat shields. And there are no necromancer stat blocks anywhere in any of like the monster manuals, Monsters of the Multiverse, Volo's Guide to Monster, nothing. And so when I took a look at it, one of the things I wanted to do, because as much as I'd love to do the witherling, one of the restrictions that you have as official like homebrew content creator is you have to operate inside the bounds of the open game license, or the OGL. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's essentially the stuff that's available to the public that Wizards of the Coast has given to us. And I know that there was the whole debacle about a little over a year, almost 2 years ago. And so it's still in our forefront and like in our minds. And so most people know what the OGL is. But it's essentially the content that Wizards of the Coast allows the public to use without having to like worry about copyright or trademark infringement. And the witherling isn't covered in the OGL, unfortunately. And so as much as I wanted to make a necromancer, I really didn't want to kind of ride that line of the OGL and be like, well, this raises witherlings, but I can't use witherlings, so is it just they raise undead? But there's all that lore there, and it's really just that wasted potential. So then I took a look at it, and one of the things it talks about a lot, like I said, is that blood magic. So I made a hematurgist, or a hemomancer, using the Greek version of hemo for blood, and I really enjoyed the way that it worked, and it really felt like I was bringing things in. Not only that, it's kind of just a blurb in the null stat block, but funnily enough, it makes up like a quarter of the hyena lore, is that gnolls and hyenas love each other. Like, the gnolls view them as like pets and almost like these kindred spirits, or essentially their brethren who haven't transformed yet. And so when you look at the gnolls, with the hyenas, they don't have any official like null masters or like a hound master for the gnolls. So I went and made 2 variants, one that charges in and leads by example, and then another one that is called the whip master, that uses a cracking whip to scare them into doing its bidding. And you don't have any of those inside of the WotC stat blocks.
Yeah, so for my example with like orcs, if you wanted to take like an orc that was a worshiper of Grumsh, for example, Grumsh is the one-eyed god. He is like the creator of the orcs, essentially. He is the most dominant of all the deities to the orcs. Now you would think you would get more than just one stat block. Surely they would add something else in to represent how important he is to their entire life cycle of an orc, essentially. If you even read into their lore, the gods of the orcs dominate their life to the point that like they are so afraid of their gods that they think that if they were to not follow their teachings, they would be smitten where they stand. So,
well, absolutely. You know, I mean, in the lore, it's the reason why goblins and orcs hate each other is because Grumsh and Maglubiet, the goblin god, hate each other so much, and they have essentially a never-ending battle on their own plane.
Yeah, and that's pretty awesome. So like if you even look into the lore for the orcs, so novices under Grumsh would be called the Watched, and then a full priest of Grumsh is called an Everwatcher.
Hmm.
There's no uniform hierarchy amongst the tribe, but you really don't. There's no stat blocks for those. For one, you have a single orc stat block. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it even says like specialty priests are known as blood spears,
Hmm.
but we don't even have a stat block for that. And like that's what's really cool about when you start making homebrew stuff is like when you really start diving into the lore. For one, you really start to learn more about the creature. And then for two, you start to learn all these extra little cool things that you never would have thought possible if you just read straight out of one of the official books, because there's years and years and years of lore that
Hmm.
never got reprinted from the older editions. So that's what I find to be very fun about homebrewing my own creature stat blocks. However, stat blocks aren't the only thing that WotC makes. They're also known for obviously making modules,
Hmm.
adventures, and other things like that. Do you have any gripes, or I know you do have gripes, so I'm going to ask you this. What gripes do you have with how Wizards of the Coast structures their adventure modules for Dungeon Masters?
Yeah, so for those who are brand new, this is your first or introduction to Anthony and I. What we like to do is we do a lot of homebrew content, and what I specialize in is lore and encounter building. I do love making stat blocks as well, so kind of that trifecta. And one of the things that really I struggle with official content is with Wizards of the Coast's content. You have plot hooks that always seem to be either railroaded or they just don't really make sense. For instance, we'll go back to Icewind Dale Rime of the Frost Maiden. It's an adventure module that I have run. I was actually super excited. For those who or for those who are listening and aren't watching, I'm right now holding up the alternative art, like the special edition
It looks
of
really cool.
the adventure module, and I had pre-ordered it. I got it day one. I was so excited to run this. It had a lot of promises, and then the issues you have inside of Rime of the Frost Maiden at the beginning is one, it just feels like a series of almost one shots for each of these towns. There's, other than if your characters are there specifically to help, which it does talk about, that's one of the key components of character creation, is trying to give your character a reason to go out adventuring. But when you go into it, it's so grindy. The first several levels are meant to be, okay, you go to this town and you help them with this or this quest, then you go to this town and you help out with this and this quest, and then after you finish off your railroad of quests, essentially, then that's when it starts. It's like, now you have to go, spoiler alert for those who are playing, players skip ahead, but then you go out into like essentially the wastes, and then it's a series of random encounter tables that you have to deal with. And granted, some of those encounters are really cool. Like there's a chance to meet the white dragon that kind of rules over the area. Once again, going back to the vampire gnolls, there's an entire cave network of them, and there are a lot of cool encounters. But once again, this is the official published adventure modules, and it's like, do these quests for these towns, and if you don't have a good reason, well, then you probably shouldn't be playing this adventure module. And then go on to the wastes and enjoy the next third of the campaign arcs doing random encounters. And that's just, it's tough for me. Do you have any gripes?
I do have some gripes with official adventure modules. One of my biggest gripes is the fact that they don't front load enough of information that you need as the dungeon master, which then requires you to read through the 20 to 30 page adventure module to figure out every little secret that is hidden for
Oh,
some reason
I
throughout
could
the
turn this
module.
into a whole episode right there.
So my biggest example, the most recent thing that I've ran for my players was the Forge of Fury. It's a 5e conversion of an original, I believe, first edition adventure.
Mhm.
So, without spoiling too much of the Forge of Fury for those that do plan on playing through it, if you're a player, I'm just going to talk about one specific spot. So if you don't want anything spoiled, skip ahead also. Spoilers for the Forge of Fury. So anyways, in Krundakar, you are trying to get into... Well, Krundakar is the place that you're trying to get into. There's multiple different entrances, which is cool. I wish more adventures had that, because as far as I'm aware, multiple different entryways is not a commonplace thing when it comes to adventures. But this is essentially a dungeon crawl adventure. And right at the start, at the most common entrance, there is a pit that the players could potentially fall in, because they have to cross a rope bridge that spans a ravine, essentially. And like you could see in this artwork here, orcs are throwing javelins at you while you're trying to cross this rope bridge. Chances are they're going to fall. At least somebody might, if they try to be bold and brash and rush across. Well, you would think if they fall, they're probably not going to survive. But what if you're very intelligent, very smart players who never break your game, obviously, try to cast Spider Climb and walk down the wall of the ravine, or cast Featherfall.
Yeah, exactly.
Featherfall.
Hey, we're on
and
that same wavelength.
jump down. Well, it doesn't even tell you, because it only assumes that if they fall down, they're not going to survive the fall. So it puts you in a corner as a dungeon master, because now what do? Do you homebrew an entire underground cave system on the spot and just try to figure out where these go? Do you try to frantically say, hold on guys, let me flip through the book here because I actually don't see it? Then you just pull everybody out of the game, the immersion's gone. Or do we just fix the problem by saying, hey dungeon masters, when they fall down this pit, they don't survive if it's 120 foot something fall, but if they were creative and went down there, here's what's actually down there. It's an underground river. Here's where it leads into these parts of the dungeon, instead of they just won't survive the fall. It's just little things like that that put more workload on you whenever running a module is supposed to take work off of you. And it just feels like there's a lot of things that need to be optimized in the adventure creation process at Wizards of the Coast, in my opinion. I'm not a designer, but
No, absolutely. And that's one thing that, kind of going back, and it ties back into the beginning statement you made. I, as a dungeon master, should not be surprised, and I shouldn't be kept in the dark about anything. The players, absolutely, but when I'm reading through the module, that's one thing I love that Call of Cthulhu does, which, by the way, for those who are interested in getting into some either Cthulhu-esque and HP Lovecraft-esque situations, it's a great system. It is skill-based instead of level-based, meaning that you upgrade your skills, but a goblin stabbing you in the heart at level 1, essentially, still hurts as much when you're a very seasoned investigator. But that's one thing that Chaosium and the Call of Cthulhu community does really well in their modules, is that they will spell out everything in the first page. And not only that, everything is spelt out up front. There's usually a before the session, essentially, paragraph that tells you the whole story leading up to it and what's going on right now up until like the final encounter. And that's what I think that a lot of things in D&D sorely lack, because it's also not just the published stuff from WotC, but there are some adventure modules that I read where it feels like, as the game master or the DM, you're being left in the dark until the end when you read that part. Not only that, another thing that really grinds my gears is when you have this adventure module, especially one that you spent money on, and it has a stat block or something crucial to the game, and it's in a different book that you have to buy. And so you're like 70 pages in, you're like, all right, I'm invested. And then it hits you with, you need this, this, and this from this other book. Now you have to spend another $30.
It would be really nice also, and obviously this is probably asking too much for, a multi-million dollar company that, you know, wouldn't dare waste a couple extra dollars on some cardboard. Maybe when you sell a book with like specific creature stat blocks in that book, you
Mhm.
give us like stat cards, like actual stat cards that come with the book instead of, putting them in the book and then saying, "Oh, well, when you run into this zombie in the Tomb of Horrors, you got to flip to the back of the book to the appendix section where all the stat blocks are. So you have to keep flipping back and forth through a 120 plus page book, and then you have to keep
Yes.
trying to find where the stat blocks are in the back. That's really annoying, also. And I just wish there were more like things that help dungeon masters run the game easier, because without dungeon masters there is no D&D. Obviously they're trying to do this whole thing where
The AI
you don't need it.
DMs.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to go anywhere, to be honest with you.
No.
Maybe some people might like it, but I think you need genuine. The whole reason you play a tabletop game is genuine human interaction with somebody, with your friends, with people you enjoy. Hopefully, people you enjoy, and not problem players that are just ruining your game. If they are, why are you playing with them? But just they need to optimize their process when it comes to creating things. And that also goes for like the wording on a lot of their abilities on stat blocks too. Not
Yes.
only because they'll sometimes have an ability that's a paragraph long, but it's just needless extra fluff text that could be shrunk down to maybe a sentence or two.
Hmm.
And they're just afraid to abbreviate things because people will just blow Jeremy Crawford up on his Twitter page or whatever he uses to answer questions. But yeah, that's my biggest gripes with adventure modules at
Yeah.
this current.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. One of the other things is we're talking about homebrew versus official content that I really like that I see in our homebrew community is we have really good stat blocks. People have figured ways to word things, I wouldn't say better, but in a different light that's a lot shorter. And while you do get the occasional stat block that is very confusing with the wording, I want to say probably about 90-95% of the homebrew stat blocks I look at are worded in shorter phrasing, which means that it's less time for you to get the gist of what an ability does, especially when you're at the table and you're trying to remember, okay, what does this spell do or what does this attack do? And it's not, okay, I have to read through this entire paragraph. I have it in 1.5 sentences and I am done. I'm ready. I remember what this does and I can use this to the best ability for my players.
I think a good example of that is when you look at traits like aggressive on this orc stat block here.
Yes.
It says, as a bonus action, the Orog can move up to its speed towards a hostile creature it can see. Instead of that, why don't we just take aggressive, we put it into a bonus action spot on the stat block, and we just say, can move up to its speed towards a hostile creature it can see.
Mhm.
Or can take the dash action as
Yeah.
bonus action only if it's towards a hostile creature. Or just like, okay, you have advantage on creatures that have half hit points or fewer. You
Mhm.
have advantage versus creatures that are bloodied. Why did we remove the bloodied condition from the game and make it more convoluted by saying it has half hit points or fewer?
Mhm.
It's just a culmination of suboptimal ways to do things that pile up and pile up until you get hour-long combats because you're trying to understand like what this does, what this does, what this does.
Well, now
Yeah.
that they've been changing the wording in the newest editions, it's not you are prone, it's you have the prone condition. And that's just needless extra fluff text.
Yeah,
It
I
takes twice as
agree.
long to say, and
It
it
doesn't
eats up
make
the stat
sense.
block. Yeah, it doesn't flow right. I get it because in other games, um, and other game systems, that's how they word it, is you have X condition. So you have the prone condition, you have the poison condition, and they're trying to keep all the wording the exact same. So instead of you are prone and you have the poison condition, it's you have the poisoned and prone conditions. So it makes sense logically, but at the same time, with how they've had it for almost all of D&D, similar to or at least all of D&D 5th edition, they've had it as you are prone. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to be switching it up.
I always say you're knocked prone.
Exactly.
It's just like in a game where you're trying to describe the stuff happening in combat, it just sucks all of the tension out when you're like, okay, you have the prone condition after the giant smacked you with his great club.
Exactly. I mean, in the way it would play it out at the table is Anthony, the giant swings his great club, smacking you in the chest, and you have the prone condition. Versus he smacks you in the chest, knocking you back on, or knocking you onto your back prone. However you want to word it, it's gonna sound so much better than "and you have the prone condition." It just kills immersion right there, in my opinion.
And I also can already kind of hear a cacophony of people saying, well, you're just bad at describing things then because you don't have to use that text. Well, I always say you can take a professional and you can give him a set of tools that are lacking in quality, and he could probably still make something that is a masterpiece because he's a master at it. But you need to make stuff, you need to give the average person more tools in their toolbox so that they can make stuff maybe not on the same level as the master, but it'll help that process of them climbing the ladder to get to that point. So like, why make it harder on the back end instead of just, keeping it simple? And I don't know, it just drives me nuts when they make all these like needless changes. I guess maybe I'm just a grognard and my edition of D&D is changing, so it's making me jaded and angry at everything. But
no, I understand that, and that's the tough part with edition changes. As someone who technically started playing in 3.5, although I really didn't start playing until 5th edition, I had friends and family who were diehard 3rd edition and 3.5 fans, and then going to 4th edition was just something that really grinded some of their gears. And then you go to 4th edition to 5th edition, and there were people who did not like that change. There were people who loved 4th edition. It's where they had began their journey in D&D. And now we have everybody who's come in 5th edition who's like, well, this 5.5e or D&D 2024, this isn't what I want. And so it's one of the holdovers of every single transition period. When you went from 1st edition to 2nd edition, I remember reading and singing this podcast about how everybody was so upset because they were changing up how rules were done. They were like, this 1st edition is the best edition, and then they added AD&D, and they're like, AD&D is the only edition that we need. And now imagine if they had stopped at just 1st edition and AD&D.
Yeah, I think a good thing to talk about next would be what our creative process is for making our own things, so we can kind of put our money where our mouth is. But I think before we get there, we should set up camp first.
I agree. Let's set up camp.
Come. Take a seat by the campfire. Did you know that you could find the Roll for Banter podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube? Wherever you roam, we're there to join your journey. If you'd like to support the podcast, consider leaving a like, a review or comment, or even sharing us with your party. Every bit of encouragement fuels our next adventure. Now, let's get back to the episode.
Well, that was a good hero's feast. I think
was.
I am immune to the poisoned and frightened conditions, so that's good.
That's good, because you have first watch. Well, Anthony,
Oh, great.
why don't you walk us through your creative process when you're creating your own content?
So you want to start with like campaign creation first, you think?
Yeah, I think campaign creation is a good starting spot for that, because everything else trickles down from campaign creation.
I agree. And it is actually, that's probably one of the most overwhelming things for a new dungeon master, is trying to create a campaign from scratch.
Mhm.
So for my creative process with making a campaign, is the first thing I'm doing, I'm figuring out, where are we starting?
Mhm.
If I don't have a map, I'm making a village or some sort of starting area, like a hub. Or some people want to do like your characters are held prisoner and you all have to
Mhm.
break out. Just something cohesive that gets all of the player characters together.
You meet in a
Because
tavern.
that's the classic one. And I think it might get, it's a little bit tropey at this point. So I like to try to do something different. Like, you all wake up and you find a letter on your person, and you
Mhm.
have summons from the Duke, who is looking for able-bodied adventurers to help with some secretive thing. Just something that grasps their attention. But it's also important that in session 0, you discuss with your players how all of their characters either know each other or would be inclined to go on an adventure. Now, this
Mhm.
is more with running the game and less campaign creation, but it is tied into campaign creation because at the start of the campaign, if the player characters don't know each other and you need to get them to know each other somehow, whether it be through some sort of catastrophic event that brings them together out of necessity or otherwise,
Mhm.
it's a good idea to get that hammered out and fleshed out. So, usually, what I do is I take all their backstories into consideration. Maybe I'll do some crafting for like NPCs that are important to their characters, and I'll go over that with each player first. So, I have the hub, I have NPCs that are specific to their characters, and then I try to come up with the first quest, because that's the most important thing. Um, if the first quest is boring, that's not good for the whole rest of the campaign, because that's going to just leave a bad taste in everybody's mouth.
Mhm.
Um, After I start making the first quest, then I try to maybe think of like how I can tie this first quest in with maybe the ending arc of the campaign. Some DMs say it's actually a good idea to work backwards, so you choose like, okay, this is the final boss and this is what happens if they fail, and then you work backwards from that. But that's a little overwhelming, especially if you're brand new. So I think for my creative process for starting a campaign, at least, it's start with the basics. How do you make the characters care and be invested?
Mhm.
How do you get them all together to become a cohesive party of player characters, and not, oh, well, I'm going to just go off and be a sheep farmer because I don't want to do this quest for the Duke because I don't like him. I made a rogue who doesn't care about authority.
Mhm.
And then you just go on the quest, dude. Okay?
You're like, listen, the the breadcrumb trail leads right here. I need you to go or have
As
nothing.
you go to turn around and leave the tavern, you instead turn around and walk back into the tavern because you
As
need
you
to go on
walk
this
out of the
quest.
tavern, you have an
You
aortic
enter the
aneurysm and
tavern.
you die.
Yeah, a meteor falls from the sky. It hits you and you explode. Um,
A random polymorph spell hits you. It's a permanent polymorph, and now you wear a fly. All right, start rolling up a
Time
new
to make a
character.
new character. Yeah, exactly.
And for those who are all up in arms, we're joking. We would never railroad that hard.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever railroaded that hard.
Mhm.
Uh,
Well,
Only
there are
if
great
I haven't
ways.
prepped enough. That's a tell sign of like I haven't prepped enough, is when I start railroading, because I'm like,
Oh,
okay, I did
absolutely.
not plan and I don't have like the mental capacity to try to like come up with everything on the spot.
Well, and that
As
actually goes into like my creative process. So whenever I'm writing adventures or encounters for DMs, is I try to keep that in mind when I'm writing. Is what information do they need to know? And I've taken from the countless different game systems. Right now, I'm learning how to play the Cipher system. I know how to play Easy D6, Call of Cthulhu, Cyberpunk, Pathfinder, first and second edition, D&D 3.5, and the list goes on. There's actually quite a few more, like Traveler and stuff like that. And so I've taken from all these other systems that I've learned or am currently learning, and I try to make my D&D content better from that. And once again, we're gonna say it because outside of D&D, my favorite gaming system is Call of Cthulhu. I think Chaosium, this is their 7th edition, and they nailed it. And so one of the things I like to do is on my first page in the first couple paragraphs, and I said it before, is I will put out everything that has happened in the encounter before the players and everything in the text that's relevant and that you might want to know, because players are going to ask you and things are going to come up that you're just not going to know. It's not going to be written down inside the adventure module, or it might be written down and it's in weird places. And when you go to that and you're trying to find it, it takes time and it kills immersion and it really bogs down the game. So at the beginning, first paragraph is just going to be, this is what's happened. And from there, then it goes into the rest of the encounter. And then I take it by a chronological order is usually what my approach is we're going to have area 1 be the starting area. And so for instance, let's take a look at one of my more recent encounters that I posted. It's available for free on my Patreon if you guys are interested, on TTRP Genius, and it's the Ettercap Cave. The way it starts is it has a quick paragraph to kind of set the mood. It's something that either you can read out to your players aloud or to help you as a game master get in the mood for this encounter. Next, I have the encounter overview where it tells you what game system this is for and what level players this was play tested for and what I would recommend. So you have level 3, this is a deadly encounter, meaning that unless you have like 5, 6, 7 players at level 3, this is probably too strong for them. And at level 5, this is a medium difficulty, meaning you could probably throw this in as a random encounter as they're walking through the woods. Next, I have my DM prep section. And in the DM prep section, it talks about everything that's not found inside this PDF. So it has the monster manual and the SRD. It has the pages where you can find the commoner stat block, Ettercap stat block, giant spider stat block, the noble stat block, and the swarm of insects stat block. And it has it for both the monster manual and SRD, which is the system reference document. It's all the free rules for D&D available. And whenever I'm trying to create as a homebrew content creator, if it's not in the SRD, I'm not going to put it in one of my stat blocks or in one of my encounters, just because I don't want you to have to go get a book that you don't already have to be able to run one of my encounters. Next, we have the setup. And the setup breaks down exactly what happens. So it's the adventurers hear someone screaming for help while traveling through the woods. They see a person being dragged into a cave by their feet by a huge spider. As they approach, they see the spider webs laced across the trees and realize this area is infested with web-dwelling creatures. The cave system is controlled by an Ettercap that uses its spider minions to capture prey and then bring it back to its feeding room deep within. The adventurers must navigate traps, face ambushes, and deal with the grot spider in the entrance tunnel. Next, it has this little section, it's the second paragraph. The person being kidnapped is a human boy 14 years old named Micah. Use the commoner stat block. In addition to Micah, his master, another human man named Johann, is 18 years old and used the noble stat block, was also grabbed by the Ettercap spiders. Micah is currently in the feeding room 5 and Johann is in the Ettercap stand 7. Then there's a map that has every single area and it's numbered chronologically of where the players most likely will go in the events that you're running this session. And so area 1, that's the forest outside of the cave. Then there's a trench and there's this makeshift web-made bridge with a fallen tree that's kind of held in place by the spider webs. Then you have the entrance to the tunnel, and the entrance opens up into 2, and it kind of splits in a Y. They're going to hear the yelling from Micah to the left, and that's something that the encounter encourages you to do throughout as they're entering into the tunnels. So chronologically, most likely they're going to go left, meaning that's the next area. So you have area 4, which is the den. or sorry, it's the area where the giant spiders live, and then you have Area 5, which in Area 5, that's where Micah is, and that's where they are disposed of all the corpses and everything. And that's also the feeding room for the lesser spiders. And then it goes back into the open area, and then you go into the nesting area, which is blocked off with all these webs. It's called a sticky web trap, and they either have to cut through it, set it on fire, which risks burning more things and getting out of hand, or they can try either nimbly dodging through or just making strength checks to break through. There's several ways to get through them, so any of the players, whoever wants to lead the charge, can do so. And then finally you have the Ettercap's lair, which is the last room. It's in the back, and the beauty of it is, the way I've made it is, it starts in area 1, then to 2, 3, 4, 5. But if your players do it in different orders, I have things for that. And I try to take into account how my players think, how I think, and how anybody who would be reading this might think. Now, there are things that are gonna happen that I couldn't prepare for. Like, what happens if one of them starts casting nonstop fireballs and sets the whole place on fire? That could happen. In that case, you probably go to the if Johan dies section at the end.
So that's your philosophy for stuff that you intend on other people running.
Mhm.
But what is your creation process for your home campaigns that you don't really intend on publishing as a module? How do you start from nothing? You just have an idea in your head to make a campaign. You know the setting, obviously. You have your players picked out. How do you start building up your campaign from scratch?
Yeah, the way I start building my campaigns from scratch are, I usually will have an idea for a theme. Now, that's something that's a little bit more new to me as a DM and a game master. Beforehand, I'd be like, what do you guys want to play? But I've realized more and more, if I'm running something that I'm excited about and that I want to run, I'm going to be providing the best game to my players. And even if it's not, if it's marking off 90% of their check boxes, they're going to have a much better time if I'm excited and I'm putting my best work into a campaign, versus they get 100% of the check boxes on their campaign, but I'm not super pumped to run it, and then I get burnt out and I'm not putting as much time into prep. And it's one of those things where it's like, oh man, I have D&D tonight. I haven't even prepped yet. I guess let's put 20 minutes into throwing something together. And I mean, we've all been there
many times.
Exactly. We've all been there. We've all had the same thought process. And so now what I do is I try to run games that I'm excited for, but I also know what my players want. And I'm actually very fortunate as a DM, as I have 2 different groups that I play with regularly. I have one that I play with online. Most of them have been former players, but as time has gone on over the last 10 years of us playing, people have moved, people have left the state, gone across the town and can't make it anymore. Whatever it is, we have 2 separate groups. And so in my home group and my Discord group, I have 4 players for each game. Sometimes it fluctuates, sometimes I have 3, sometimes I have 5, but usually it's 4. And that's because for me also, I feel like if I have 3 to 4 players, I'm running the best game. When I have less than that, it's harder for me, as it feels like it's more of me trying to make up for the fact that they have less people, and that might be a shortcoming as a DM or for myself. And if I have more people, then I struggle with keeping combats interesting and keeping everybody engaged. And so I found that my perfect number is 3 to 4 players. And so when I'm preparing for my D&D prep on a first session and for a world, I usually start very similar to you. I will start with an idea and a small area. So whether that be we're starting in this village and this is what's going on in the village, or it might be this is the castle, or it's a premise. And it's usually something that's inspired me from something I either watched or a book I'm reading, or maybe an idea that I had while reading through lore or working on an encounter of mine. Whatever it is, we start small and we build from there. And then a very important part of that is I love incorporating long backstories. Now, your mileage varies, and I know that there are DMs out there. I've had DMs, and there are campaigns that I've run where it's like I just want a couple paragraphs of a backstory, and then I'm gonna call him out. I have a player, and we'll just use the first letter of his name, so we'll call him Jay. Jay is an author. Jay loves writing, and Jay really gets into his characters. Jay, when he creates a character, will usually write anywhere between 8 and sometimes up to like 15, 20 pages of backstory. Their whole life lore. But the thing is he does a really good job of, he also sets up his family, he sets up people he knows, people from his past, his enemies, debts that he might owe.
That's a good thing to have as
And
a dungeon master.
Exactly. And so when I'm doing it, yeah, it's a little bit more homework, and I usually have to write notes on his backstory, but he gives me so much. And that's something that, you know, I've asked from my players is I use my own version of a 10-minute backstory. It's a free resource that I think it's from like 2008, and it's just called 10-minute backstory. You can Google it, and it's a great thing if you're a new player trying to really find a way to inspire your backstory, because it gives you things like, give us 3 specific memories your characters have had. What are their goals? More than just like their bond and their idea. Like what are goals as the player that you have for your adventurer? And other things like, who are 3 people tied to you? 2 of them can be allies and 1 has to be an enemy. So then it gives you so much to work with as a game master. And then when I'm finished, I try to find ways to weave characters from other people's backstory, or from my players' backstories together, especially unnamed or very loose concept characters. And then I can't remember where I saw this. Very well could be from Seth Skorkowski now that I'm thinking about it. But those players, or those people in the players' backstories, do not have to be who they are right now. Just like how your players have gone on this huge changing journey, if you bring up a person from a backstory, or from the backstory 20 sessions in, that person's gone through 20 sessions worth of growth just as your players. And he uses the example of Lando and Han Solo from Star Wars. When they first met and were new, or when they had first met in the backstory, and when Han had last seen Lando, they were smugglers. Now Lando is this essentially governor-esque figure inside of this cloud city. It's like, yeah, things change. People continue to live outside of that backstory. And so, spoiler alert for my players. I mean, this is kind of a minor spoiler and probably not a huge surprise at this point, but go ahead and skip ahead if you're listening. But for instance, there's a guy that's tied into 2 players' backstories. His name is Captain Hamish. He was from the Raid Wars, and he was one of the players' generals, or captains, I believe, at the time. And another player, he's this monstrous race. He's a half lizard folk, half dragonborn hybrid. And he was taken captive as like a child by Hamish. And so they have very different views. And now Hamish is this minor lord who now has his own castle up in the mountains, and he's doing stuff. But, you know, if we left it as is, Hamish in each person's backstory was his old former captain and the guy who kidnapped me as a child. Now he's a lord who commands a small force and is doing a lot of things in the background. And so I love to like look at what my players have gone through, and that's what inspires me as a DM. To better answer your question, is what are the people tied to them doing now, and what can I do to make it interesting for them?
So, do you figure out what the ending arc of the campaign will be before, or do you sort of just kind of wing it until you get there? Like, do you have an idea for like what the BBEG is going to be when you start the campaign, or do you figure that out along the way?
I try to not do that anymore. Reason being is I've run a lot of campaigns that have never ended, and games that have fizzled out, whether it be work schedule conflicts, people moving, just work-life balance, whatever it may be. Very seldom do my campaigns end where I was expecting them to, and sometimes they go on even longer than I thought that they would. There are campaigns I've been in where I was like, man, I thought this would have been done like an entire arc or two ago. And so I'll bring up an example. My first ever game I was trying to run as a DM, I had the entire world lore. I had an entire world map, all these continents, people. I had trade networks. I had the whole 9 yards, the whole histories of everybody. And it was from all this lore that I had been reading on and everything that like it had inspired me and all these ideas that I've been putting together for like the better part of a year almost. And I had the whole idea for the villain. It was this tragic backstory, and it was like one of those things where maybe the players will side with him in the final battle. Who knows? It was supposed to be like this whole arcing campaign, and it was going to be this epic that was going to be remembered by my players until the days that they died. Like on their deathbeds, they'll be like, yes, as much as I love you, Timmy, you'll never be as great to me as this campaign August ran for me like 50 years ago. And I had put so much work into that, and like at the beginning of the campaign, things started going in different directions, and I felt more like I had a railroad to get the ending I wanted. And like that campaign never made it to that epic final battle. It was a campaign that, due to work stuff, it fizzled out as most first campaigns will.
As many do. There's
Exactly.
many a graveyard for first time campaigns that were supposed to be these great epics.
And many amazing and epic stories that will never be concluded. But nowadays what I do is I'll have a general idea. I don't really want to spoil the campaign I'm running right now, so I'm not gonna quite do that because I know my nosy players might be listening in. But I have an idea for what's gonna be going on. I have now more of what I think instead of this is what's gonna happen and this is the ending. I think of what is the big bad evil guy doing, and regardless of whatever the players do, what has he done and what is he gonna continue to do? And if the players never intercept them, what is gonna be the outcome of that? Because ultimately my players could go on and be like, listen, we're gonna go mine gems in this dwarven metropolis, and they never see the light of day again. And it's like, well, that's the campaign that this turned into, and I'll try to find a way to make that fun. But also, you know, that world-ending BBEG that you guys were supposed to take care of isn't gonna just stop doing his evil plans, and so things will come to pass.
That's a good point. It's making the world feel like it's alive regardless of what the players do, because that really helps with immersion. Like, it's if they do it and they help, you know, things go into place and fall into place, that's great. But if they don't help one side in a war with another side, the war is going to happen regardless. And you know, maybe you determine what side wins with a die roll off screen, and then, you know, they feel the repercussions of that war ripple throughout the kingdom or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a really cool thing that I learned late into my DMing career. Not that it's over or it's coming to an end, but I haven't really delved too deep into that. I was always worried about, like, okay, what are the players going to do? What are the players going to do? What are the players going to do? But also you have to worry about what's happening in the world around them too, because otherwise they're just not going to care. Everything's going to feel like a 2D cardboard cutout of everything.
Absolutely.
Like,
there's no depth to it when you do it like that. And that's one thing.
Yeah.
You know, bringing up an example from our session 2 sessions ago, I want to say it was either last session at the end or I mean at the beginning, or 2 sessions ago at the end. But anyways, my players were inside this camp that they had gone to, and they were checking out. They had found this map, and there were areas marked on the map, and so they had gone to this one area, and I had prepared a lot of content for this area. And they got there and they started kind of figuring things out, and they're like, you know what, let's go to this other area because we want to see, because they started getting these inklings of ideas, and the players are their own red herons. That's why I never add red herons into my games, because the players will make enough of them as is. And
You
so
described the chair a little bit too much in its description. That's got to be part of the puzzle in the room.
exactly. And so they figured this red heron, and they were gonna go check out this one area, but I was like, I don't have really anything other than 3 sentences scribbled out for that entire area because I wasn't expecting them to go there. And so one thing I did was, they were gonna camp the night, and they were gonna go first thing in the morning. In the night, I had a catalyst happen that essentially for this area, this pack of werewolves that were more like a druidic tribe, that had lived in like this area for long before the humans started to settle it. And that was like the whole reason that they were here, was they were investigating these circles, and the circles mean something. I'm not gonna spoil it once again for my players, but I had a werewolf howl go in the background, and I had the captain of the guard for this little trading post and his men run out into the darkness, and that's where I left it. If they really didn't want to go, then we would figure out what those 3 sentences mean when they get to the next place. And it's gentle railroading, because I know my players are not going to let that slide. They didn't like this captain. First off, they were suspicious. Why does this trading post need a captain of a guard? Why does he have so many well-armed men? It was very suspicious. And they're going to let this guy run off after they said that they had like these like demon wolves in the woods. No, not at all. So they're going to charge in there, and then that starts getting the ball rolling to what I have prepared. And it's one of those things that I've learned as a DM over years, is how to do what I like to call soft railroading, where if you really want your players to do something, but you don't want to be like, hey, you guys are going to do this, do things that you know your players, adventurers, would want to check out, or like that would set them off, instead of being like, hey guys, I literally have 3 sentences written down, whereas I have everything prepared for this werewolf tribe that you guys need to go to because it's very important to plot line. It's okay. Your players, or sorry, one of the characters, his name is Brannick. That's the adventurer's name. Like, Brannick, you're on watch, and you hear from your tent the sound of a wolf's howl, and then you see the captain of the guard with his men and their torches ready, running into the forest. That was enough to set them off. It got them going, and I didn't have to actually railroad them into it.
Sometimes it's nice when you prepare something and they spend like hours on that little thing, and you're like, well, it's like you get more bang for your buck.
Oh,
like
yeah.
you get more time out of your prep. That's happened to me a lot. I like to put a lot of detail and, things that are meant to like kind of give like an imposing feel. So my players, actually, I'll tell a story of my own, I guess. So my players were searching for something, and they went into this old abandoned dwarven metropolis that has been evacuated hundreds of years ago. And actually, that ties into, if you have the Megalomortis stat block that we made, Necrothene. Necrothene was mined out of the walls by accident, and it flooded the city and turned the inhabitants into undead. So the dwarves that were alive fled the city, and it just left it there, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But they went into this underground city, and I'm pretty much just describing all these little things that they see around them, and they want to interact with everything that they see. And I planned on some little side things that they could do, but it took maybe an hour just to get through one of them, and I had like maybe 4 sentences for it, but they were like meticulously going over everything in the area. But that's actually, it kind of feels rewarding as a dungeon master when they do that, because then you're like, okay, I feel like I've done a good job to stoke their curiosity and imaginations enough to want to really investigate everything. So it is a kind of a cool feeling whenever they do that. How are you doing on time?
By my calculations, it's almost time for your watch to start.
Great. Well, let's get to that then.
Alright, be careful. While I was out collecting firewood, I had to roll a perception check, and I rolled poorly, and the DM said, I don't see whatever was watching me, so good luck.
Great. Thanks, August.
Thanks for stopping by our campfire. If you want to keep the story going, follow Roll for Banter on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and don't forget to leave a review. It's like giving our podcast advantage on our saving throw against the algorithm. Until next time, stay safe and keep the banter flowing.